Wow, this must be Old Man Lovecraft's cabin. I wonder what sort of stuff could be inside. I should take a look around. Golly, it sure is dusty in here, and it looks like Old Man Lovecraft left some books lying around. The Necronomicon, what's that?
Have you ever wanted a highly stylized, visually impressive game full of unique and creepy creatures, fun bosses, and eerie world design? Then look no further than this. Sorry, Daddy. Forgive Me, Father is a retro FPS boomer shooter inspired by the works of one Howard Phillips Lovecraft, just like every other horror IP for the last 6 years. If you're anything like me, then you love anything horror or horror adjacent, but also like me, you're a little burnt out by the torrential tsunami of Lovecraft-inspired games, movies, and books that have bombarded the cultural zeitgeist in the past few years. Some of which have been really good, and others maybe not so good. Still, every once in a while I pick one of the games from the pile of eldritch horror games on Steam and decide to give it a whirl, to varying degrees of success. Forgive Me, Father initially caught my attention with its comic book art style and cool looking enemies. I figured I would be in for a quick little romp through a stylish run-of-the-mill retro shooter, and what I got is a well-crafted game world that is certainly easy on the eyes, but one that is also littered with a fair few issues that left me with some conflicting feelings on the game overall, but we'll get to those later. To start off, let's talk about the first thing that's going to draw most people to this game, the visuals. Now, I'm not one to be super particular about how a game looks. Hell, a couple of videos ago I said one of my favorite games was Cataclysm Dark Days Ahead, and that game looks like it was made on a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet. But I'll be honest and say that all it took for me to buy this game was looking at the screenshots on the Steam page. And overall, I'll come out and say that the visuals in this game are pretty impressive. The game is a mashup of 2D sprite work in a 3D environment, and everything is done up with these super dark, inky lines that give the game a real grimy and gritty look, and is pretty obviously inspired by old school noir comics. This kind of art style has been used to pretty big success plenty of times before in games like Darkest Dungeon, for example. The enemy designs especially are really where the game shines. You've got everything from your typical possessed zombie type to more grotesque looking fishmen and crabmen, and even explosive barrels that grow limbs and run towards you to blow you to pieces. Enemy sprites even have several different variants that change based upon whatever level environment they're found in. This especially is a really nice touch, as I find that in these types of games, seeing hundreds of the same looking enemies tends to get stale pretty quickly. I especially like the design of the Liquidators, who are these World War I style soldiers that have grown Cthulhu-esque tentacles and walk around shooting balls of acid. The game also does a pretty good job of continuously throwing new enemy types at you as the game goes on. Every time you head into a new chapter of the game, you'll have some new type of enemy that you're forced to deal with. And there's new enemies popping up pretty much all the way into the last levels of the game. And I gotta give the dev props here for not playing their full hand too early and just showing off all the enemies before the halfway point like a lot of other boomer shooters do. The environments here are also just spectacular. Everything is just so dark and dirty looking, and they do a fantastic job of selling this early 1900s look. And just like the enemies, there's an insane amount of variety here. You've got everything from hospitals to sewers, secret labs, crystal caves, and of course ancient eldritch cityscapes. I appreciate all the effort that went into making all of these maps and ensuring that there would be plenty of variety between all of the levels. You've got everything from your standard linear dungeon type of level to more open style arena environments, looping maze-like corridors, some platforming sections thrown in for good measure, and even an underwater level. There's 32 levels all up here, spread across 5 different worlds, each with their own unique boss at the end. And some of these levels can be pretty lengthy too, with a good chunk of them taking upwards of 15 to 20 minutes to beat. So from the get-go, you're going to be in for a pretty long ride. not to mention the fact that there's 2 playable characters here, both with their own unique skills and abilities, which means you're going to have to do at least 2 playthroughs to experience both characters. When you first start up the game, you get the choice between either the priest or the reporter for your playthrough, with the main difference between the two being in their abilities. Each character gets 5 different abilities with their own upgrade paths to level up as you play. The priest is described as having less crowd control but shorter cooldowns on his abilities, while the reporter gets the opposite, with more crowd control but longer cooldowns overall. The abilities for both characters are also tied to their madness meter, which is this little square at the bottom right that slowly fills up from either killing enemies or drinking bottles of alcohol you find scattered around the levels. Filling this meter to a certain point will give you a charge for each of your various abilities, as well as making you do more damage to enemies, and in turn making your character take less damage. For the priest, you start out with a lantern ability used to light up some of the game's darker areas, and then you unlock the crucifix, which lets you heal a small amount of health over time. You then get the ability to splash holy water on your enemies, which stuns them for a few seconds to allow you to get a few hits in. Then finally you get the Necronomicon, which makes you invulnerable for a short duration, as well as a medallion that gives all of your weapons infinite ammo for a short time. For the reporter, you get equipped with a flashlight instead of a lantern, and your first offensive ability comes in the form of a golden sword that you can swing at enemies to deal damage and heal a bit of health with each hit. You get a camera, which sets off a flash that stuns all nearby enemies in a radius around you, and a voodoo doll, which causes a small damaging explosion in a circle around your character. And finally, some cigarettes, which slow down time for a few seconds. As I said earlier, each of these abilities can be upgraded to improve their effectiveness, doing things like giving you a longer duration on your stuns or increased health to the respective abilities. Overall, the priest's abilities feel a lot more defensive and supportive with the invulnerability and the healing, while the reporter is a lot more offense heavy with the time slow and especially the golden sword, which is an absolute monster, especially when upgraded. Speaking of which, I should probably talk about the leveling system in this game. As you progress through the story killing enemies and defeating bosses, you'll gain levels that can be used to upgrade your character, and I actually really like this system overall, as it gives you more options for how you want to play, as well as making it so your character progression isn't just tied to whatever weapons you find throughout the world. Besides the character specific abilities I just talked about, there's also some generic upgrades that are the same across both characters. These are pretty basic and do things like increase your max health and armor or allow you to carry more ammo for all your weapons, but what you're probably going to spend most of your upgrade points on is the weapon upgrades. Each weapon in the game has its own upgrade path, with most of them forcing you to pick between 2 choices for your weapon's final upgrade. Thankfully though, every time you kill a boss, you're given a respec token that allows you to reset all of your abilities and reallocate all of your previously earned points. So if you end up with an upgraded weapon you don't like, you won't be locked into your choice for the rest of the game. Now, I think we can all agree that any retro style shooter worth its salt needs a fairly strong selection of weapons to hold everything together, and thankfully all of the weapons here are pretty stellar, and all of them stay effective right up until the end of the game. In a lot of these titles, you'll usually end up throwing away your starter pistol as soon as you get your hands on something better, but here, even your starting revolver can be upgraded to stand on par with any of the other weapons in the game. You start off the game with a basic melee weapon in the form of a knife that can be upgraded into a machete that deals more damage, or it can be turned into a set of throwing knives, and later into mutated eldritch throwing knives that actually do a decent bit of damage and have unlimited ammo, although they fly in an arc, and I could never really seem to hit enemies on a consistent basis. Next up is your revolver, which can either be dual-wielded for double the power, or it can be turned into an upgraded Mauser pistol that has a faster fire rate and pinpoint accuracy. This thing is an absolute beast and was probably one of my most used weapons throughout my playthrough, as it allows you to easily snipe some enemies over a large distance. And what would any good shooter be without a proper shotgun? Here you're given the staple sawed-off shotgun with a slow reload speed but high damage. It can be upgraded into a power shotgun for increased damage, but to be honest, I didn't really notice much of a difference between the power shotgun and the standard version, and I'm not really sure why you would ever choose this version over the other upgrade path, which nets you the abyssal shotgun, which is easily one of the best weapons in the game, firing a massive amount of bouncing pellets over a large area that do high damage and turn everything in front of you into Swiss cheese, and it has a much faster reload speed than any of the other versions. Then you have a burst fire machine gun that's actually a fairly decent little weapon in its own right, and does some fairly good damage with its 3-round burst. This can be upgraded to increase its damage and make it full auto, or it can be turned into a grenade launcher that throws out bouncing balls of energy that explode on contact. In a similar vein, you've also got a fully automatic Tommy gun that boasts a faster fire rate than the other machine gun, but with slightly less damage and accuracy. The upgrade choices for this one are either just a generic fire rate and damage upgrade, or you can turn it into a powerful laser weapon that shoots out a constant beam of high damage energy. There's a harpoon gun here as well that serves as a sort of sniper rifle, firing out a single bolt or 3 at a time if upgraded, that does high damage with good accuracy. I didn't use this one all that much, to be honest, as the projectiles themselves are fairly small and I couldn't hit the broadside of a barn with this thing. That's probably on me though. Finally, to round round things out, the last two weapons you'll get your hands on are a plasma cannon and an energy grenade launcher, both of which are absolute powerhouse weapons that do extremely high damage, but chew through your ammo reserves like nobody's business. And unlike any of the other weapons, these two actually have their upgrade paths linked. On one hand, you can choose to leave your basic grenade launcher as is and instead turn your plasma cannon into the worm nest, which shoots out a trail of worms across the floor, exploding when it hits an enemy and doing massive area of effect damage. Or you can choose to put a small damage upgrade on your plasma cannon that leads into an upgraded version of the grenade launcher that gives it much higher damage and fire rate. Personally, I chose the latter of the two upgrade paths as I thought the plasma gun was just way too good of a weapon to give up entirely. Again, the game really encourages you to experiment here to find out what you like. You can dump all of your points into your abilities if you'd like and go for something more akin to a caster build if that's your thing, or you can just go all out on the guns and shred anything and everything in your path. Hell, you can even just flat out put all of your points into health and armor and go for a tank build if you want. Since a lot of the weapons are a bit repetitive here with two very similar machine guns and a handful of explosive AoE weapons, having those respec tokens is pretty important for figuring out what kind of playstyle you like. And I think there's a good mix of gameplay here overall, with the earlier levels feeling a lot more claustrophobic and forcing your character to play a lot more slowly since they don't have access to a lot of the guns or abilities yet. And later on, you'll be fighting through hordes of enemies in various arenas, feeling like an absolute god, killing everything in sight. There's even some light puzzle solving and exploration elements, so if nothing else, the game gets some points for just sheer overall variety. The bosses too all feel really well crafted as well. At the end of each world, you'll face off against a boss who is usually some sort of eldritch nightmare trying to stop you from reaching your goal. Oh, and I'm about to spoil all of the game's bosses here, so if that's something that bothers you, here's your warning. Generally, all the bosses in the game take the form of static arena hazards that just sort of throw projectiles at you and don't move around very much, with one exception. Funny enough, the first boss, Catharsis, and the final boss, Cthulhu, are actually pretty similar, both of which just stand off in the distance and chuck projectiles at you while you throw as many bullets as you can towards them. And these two both feel like the easiest bosses in the game in my opinion. While the final boss is definitely going to throw a shitload of high damage projectiles at you that you need to avoid, not having to keep track of a boss moving around the arena definitely makes these fights feel a lot more manageable. Meanwhile, the second and third bosses in the game are Aziz, who is basically just the King in Yellow for anyone who knows that novel. It's a banger, by the way, go read it. And the Big Ugly Fish. Both of these bosses revolve around dodging their arena hazards and are definitely a little bit more difficult to take care of. Aziz forces you to take out some shield generating crystals littered around his arena before you're able to damage him, all while shooting out this moving laser wall that insta-kills you if you touch it. And the fish is fought in the middle of a swamp where he's constantly destroying whatever solid ground you're standing on, forcing you to be constantly moving to avoid falling into the damaging water. In my opinion, these two are easily the most fun boss fights in the game, and I think this is where the game is at its strongest. Lastly, there's the fourth boss, Glitch. Unlike the others, he'll actually move around the arena like a normal enemy, constantly spawning clones of himself that attack you and run around the arena at Mach speed. This boss is really more annoying than anything else, and most of the time you'll be running around the arena looking for ammo pickups so that you can land a few shots on him as he runs around the arena like a cracked out toddler. Overall though, I think all of the bosses in this game are fairly well done, and I can definitely appreciate the effort that went into making them. But now is the time where I need to start talking about some of the things I disliked about this game, starting off with the story. Now, look, I don't necessarily care about the story in a game like this. I mean, we're all pretty much here for the gameplay, right? A wise man once said that the plot of a boomer shooter is a lot like the plot of a porno. Most people probably aren't going to be paying much attention. Hell, I don't think anyone was too invested in the story when the original Doom came out, but this game makes a point of putting a lot of emphasis in the game's story with little lore notes scattered about and some cutscenes sprinkled in here and there. The plot is more or less as follows. Your cousin sends you a letter one day telling you about a bunch of crazy stuff that's going on in your hometown with people going mad and strange demons everywhere. So you hop on a train and head back to your hometown to look for your cousin and figure everything out. I honestly would have been okay if this was all you were given until the end, but as you progress, you learn more about the fate of your cousin and what happened to the townsfolk. And honestly, I just wasn't at all invested in the story. Like I said, I don't think the story in these types of games matters too much, but I still feel the need to point it out. Chances are you probably already know where this plot is headed just with the few little tidbits I've given you already. You find out the townsfolk were trying to summon an old god, and everyone went mad and turned into monsters. If you've played through any Lovecraft-inspired horror game before, then you know that all of the plots are more or less just the same, and if you've played one, you've played them all. Maybe I'm just a bit burnt out from the whole Lovecraft-inspired horror shtick, and it's made me a bit cynical, but I just can't be bothered to care about these kinds of storylines anymore. The whole plot here just feels kind of watered down and cliche to the point where I'm not really even sure the game needed one. Not to mention that there's never any shocking, horrific twists in the plot because you just see everything coming from a mile away. Even the twist at the end, which I won't spoil, I easily saw coming simply because it's been done 100 times before, and the notes you find scattered about the game mostly feel like generic Lovecraft scrawlings, or what I'm guessing is the nonsense scribblings of a madman. I get the sense that there were probably some translation issues here, and considering this game was made by a small team from Poland, I can't really fault them too much for this. But it definitely comes across as poorly translated in a lot of the game's writing. The gameplay here is definitely enough to make up for the lackluster story, but I still think it's important for me to at least mention. And then there's the voice acting. Oh my god, the voice acting.
Devilish tricks, they try to confuse me.
I had to get poisoned. In this kind of place, it's quite easy.
You've really only got 3 voice characters in this game. The narrator, who is fine, perfectly serviceable, and then the playable characters, being the priest and the reporter, and they are both just awful.
Thank you, sir. Very cool.
I really don't want to be mean here, but the voice lines in this game are just bad. The priest sounds like he's trying to do an impression of Caleb from Blood, but it doesn't come across as cool and sarcastic like Caleb was.
I smell vom and poontang.
Instead, it just sounds kind of cringy. His line delivery is just kind of off in a way that I don't really know how to describe.
You will pay.
And the reporter is even worse. Her lines are all just annoying, and I was hoping she would end up being like this hardcore, badass reporter chick, but instead she just sounds like a sorority girl.
I didn't sign up for these working conditions.
All of the little quips she spouts during the game honestly make me kind of want to root for Cthulhu. I don't think this was necessarily the fault of the voice actors themselves either. I think a lot of it comes from the combination of poor writing and minimal direction. If you're going to make a Lovecraft-inspired game, then you should probably tell your voice actors to try and emphasize the slow descent into madness that cosmic horror is supposed to cause. Instead, both voice actors come across like they're on a fun field trip where there just so happens to be some monsters to shoot.
Cheese!
I like when games of this genre have a voice protagonist that give the player some character and personality, but it's often a fine line between enjoyable and just downright annoying, and the voice acting here is definitely in the latter category. The rest of the sound in the game is actually pretty great, and there's some really great heavy metal tracks here to back up some of the fights, but I kept running into an issue where the music would just keep playing even after I was out of a fight, and it just felt kind of strange to be walking around in an empty environment while intense heavy metal music plays in the background. I can't play any of these segments for copyright, but it does lead me to bring up some of the technical issues in this game. First off, the performance issues. Now, I've got a decent enough PC setup that should be more than capable of running this game smoothly, but I experienced a lot of stuttering and frame rate issues in some of the larger levels throughout the game. And from what I've read of other people who played the game, this seems pretty prevalent across the board. On top of that, I had some issues with texture clipping and bugs, and some of the areas in this game just have way too many textures, and it makes the environments look cluttered, and it can make it really hard to distinguish where enemies are, or even where you're supposed to be going. There's even a couple of game-breaking bugs, like this one where I got stuck in an arena after beating it with no way out until I reloaded a save. Graphically, too, the game comes out of the gate with a few graphical options that I personally found to be kind of annoying. The game has a shitload of bloom by default that I actually think hurts the comic book art style they're trying to go for, so that got turned off pretty quick. When your character is at full madness, the game also puts itself into complete black and white. This might be fine for some people, but the more I played, the more this bothered me, as it made fighting and distinguishing between enemies in the environment a lot more difficult, so that got turned off as well. There's also a grain filter turned on by default that I ended up switching off about halfway through, as it made some of the darker areas look really muddy and worn out. And speaking of the dark areas, as I said earlier, you're given a lantern or a flashlight to light up some of the areas at the beginning, but the problem is that you can't hold a weapon when you have your lantern out. This means that when you come across an enemy in a dark area, you have to put down your light source and shoot around blindly in the dark until you've hopefully killed them. This was super annoying to deal with. I wish that they would have just let you keep your knife or your pistol drawn when you're using a light source, which makes perfect sense to me considering your character's got 2 hands anyways. And finally, and probably the most egregious issue with Forgive Me Father, is the gameplay. Now, don't get me wrong, the gameplay is honestly really fun, but it suffers from being just too much of a good thing. The game drags, and it really overstays its welcome. Some people would say that it's not fair of me to complain about there being too much game, but I honestly disagree. A lot of the levels here just take way too long to beat, and the pacing throughout the game is off. Many of the levels are clearly just filler. There were several points during my initial playthrough where I was just trying to speedrun to the end of the level because things had just become so tedious that I was desperate to get to the next area. There's only so much running and gunning you can do against the same enemy types in the same arenas before you just want to get it over with. I should also mention that the difficulty is laughably easy in the first half of the game, even on the harder difficulties, but takes a huge spike upward at the midpoint during the third boss, after which it feels like the developers were trying to throw in all the ideas they had left on the drawing board. The environments start constantly changing in ways that don't really make a lot of sense, and they start throwing things like level hazards and puzzles at you for seemingly no reason. I saw a lot of people complaining online that the game just sort of falls apart in the second half, and I can't really blame them for this, as it really does feel like the developers were just trying to keep you interested enough to get you to the end. But by this point, I was mostly just trying to get the game over with so that I could say that I finished it. And this was just for my initial playthrough with the priest. Afterwards, I had to do another run with the reporter, and I didn't even bother to touch New Game Plus or the Endless mode. So with all that being said, what do I think? Well, the art style is fantastic, and the game's got some really cool set pieces that don't necessarily make up a great game as a whole. The weapons and abilities are cool, but there's some pretty glaring issues here that are definitely going to turn people off. Honestly, I'd say grab this one on sale if it looks interesting, otherwise you can wait for the sequel, which launched in early access back in October and is quite far from being finished. And that's pretty much all I have to say about that. If you liked the video, consider subscribing and maybe leaving me a like or a comment down below to let me know what you think. If there's any cool games like this one out there that you want to see a video on, let me know down below. And as always, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.